we found a model that was spiritually and culturally based, that was sensitive to language and culture, listening to the person themselves tell you what their experience was and what they needed.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. This is the third episode in Talking About Kids series using the history of home-based youth services to examine the life cycle of nonprofits, from founding through hardships and into maturity. My guest this episode to discuss managing a mature nonprofit is Dede Yazzie Devine. Dede is the CEO of Native American Connections, a position she has held for over 40 years. Now, some nonprofit administrators embody the mission of an organization. Others master the technical logistics of the work. Somehow, Dede does both, which is why she's among the finest public servants I have ever encountered. And the numerous awards she has received are evidence that I am not the only person who feels that way. In fact, Dede was included in the state's official list of the 48 most intriguing Arizona women of all time. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I knew service was a part of my life because my parents both served. My parents served in very different ways, but I came to the nonprofit not knowing that. But very quickly, I realized how impactful Native American Connections was in being a life-saving service. People were coming maybe at a very low point in their life, and able to move on into the community, adding value to the next person that came along in the same situation they were in. So pretty quickly, I realized the value of working for a nonprofit organization, that it was not just a job, but it was a mission, and it grew to be part of my life, 44 years of my life. Yeah.
Sure. When Native American Connections started, it kind of started with one core program or service, but it's really expanded. So talk a little bit about, that first program that Native American Connections started with, but then also how you decided to expand. Because a lot of nonprofits don't. A lot of nonprofits kind of stick with one service. This is what we do. But that hasn't been the history of Native American Connections.
Yeah, so the original mission of Native American Connections, and I'm going to call it NAC going forward, NAC was really to serve the growing Native American population. Phoenix was a relocation city where they relocated Native people for workforce development and assimilation, government strategies. And so the Native population was moving from the reservation into the urban areas at a pretty rapid rate, but didn't have the social, cultural, and service connections to the community. And so really we opened this first facility. It was really an alcohol and drug rehabilitation center called Indian Rehabilitation. But really quickly they would come to us maybe off the streets, homeless, come off the Greyhound bus at the bus depot, and really they were looking for something much broader. And today we call it, the social determinants of health, the whole person model,
Hmm.
mind, body, spirit. We call that, but they were really people that were maybe struggling with behavioral health issues, but would come into this small residential, about a 12-bed facility, and then they would say, but I can't return to the same environment. I need a safe, secure place to live. I need
Hmm.
a job that has meaning and a livable wage. And so very quickly we realized we were serving a community of needs, not just a single
Hmm.
service. And so the Native population was about 10,000 when I started. And today in the Phoenix metropolitan area, it's about 120,000 Native people and still growing.
Wow.
So really, I can't say that we had to have a strategic plan or a big decision. The native population was growing, and their needs were continuing to grow. And every time we
Right.
expanded, it was there. And then we began serving all populations. That we found a model that was spiritually and culturally based, that was sensitive to language and culture, listening to the person themselves tell you what their experience was and what they needed, what the community needs were, right
Hmm.
away listening to them about whatever expansion or what other needs they had. That became our model of growth and serving all populations, whether it was diverse racial and ethnic populations or homeless youth.
Hmm.
I think those same values resonated with all the populations that we began to serve.
It was an interesting discussion that we had when I was on board. I remember those discussions when I was on the board of Native American Connections. This notion of um, if we expand our services, are we expanding them to serve all people? And that includes more services for Native individuals. And that was an interesting model, right? It wasn't focused just on services for Native individuals, which were really important, but this idea that if we expanded all services, we could serve more Native people while serving more Latinx population, more Black population, and more white population.
And that was actually debated within our clients, our staff, and at the board of directors level, which I think it's important
Yeah.
to raise that voice at all those levels. And so we did start from that single house. The first year I
Hmm.
was there, we actually acquired that physical property, which was unusual for a nonprofit. Back then you were told you can only
Hmm.
lease, you can't own assets, and we actually acquired it. Interesting story for maybe another time, but in a card game for $1 down. One of those old 1970s
Really?
stories that you could not do today.
That's
Uh,
fantastic. No,
yeah.
I love that. Well, because see, now I want to hear about the card game, but except that, I think it's important when you talk about Native American connections, Dee Dee, and when you talk about the mission, it has this it has a very spiritual air to the discussion. You absolutely talk about meeting the needs, the spiritual needs, the community needs of the people who receive services from Native American Connections, from NAC. But I also know you as a technocrat. You understand the details of the laws, of the grants, of the inner workings of a nonprofit. How did that come to be? When did you realize that you didn't just need to understand the population you were serving, but you had to understand the rules and regulations and the research?
So I'm going to say that after probably that started occurring, we were able to take on a Guiding Star, a women's program. So kind of in that history of growth by other nonprofits that were struggling, bringing an existing nonprofit that maybe didn't have the sustainability or the back office shop.
Hmm.
And so we quickly began expanding with women's services, women and children, keeping the family together. And we've done that with other nonprofits, including Home Base. But
Hmm.
we bought some property in downtown Phoenix. We were already a property owner. I mean, can you imagine that? It's still in the 70s, and that changes your mind
Yeah.
shift. That changes, okay, downtown Phoenix was in decline at the time. Now it's a
Yeah.
growing, thriving. Property values are sky high, and we
Right.
acquired some other properties in the downtown Phoenix area, actually three more, when the land values were very cheap. And so
Yeah.
it began that, well, this is kind of the neighborhood in which we want to be located. Native people live there. There are a lot of human service organizations there. The transportation was available there. The amenities were downtown. Why should our service
Right.
population be able to continue to grow and expand and live in the downtown areas? Jobs were available. And so I'm going to say those things kind of came organically and naturally, just as you thought
Mm.
about your service population. But I'm going to say the late 90s, we became involved in a community development, national community development strategy of
Mm-hmm.
growth. And that really began your change in thinking of how you're managing your physical assets to improve the outcomes of the people in the mission that you're serving. And so I went back to school. A lot of my counterparts got social work degrees or human service degrees. I went back and actually got an
Mm-hmm.
MBA. I knew that I knew the
Oh.
heart of the organization. Thank you for saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And that I wasn't always kept my ear to listen to the voice of the community and the people we were serving. But what I didn't know was how we were rapidly expanding and the business and the sustainable aspect. So we're part of this larger
Yeah.
community development effort, looking at the way we were serving the community in a broader way, the way we're looking at our assets. And then I got my MBA, and everybody was asking me, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to do next? And I said, I'm
Right.
purposely getting it so that I can grow and sustain the nonprofit that I work for. And people just didn't quite understand that. But I'm
No.
going to say from then on, really understanding all the compliance, the regulation, the
Yeah.
underlying, as you call it, technocrat part of that, and building the
Right.
infrastructure equal to small, that the infrastructure of NAC is there to serve the people that work on direct service every day in our community.
Mm-hmm.
But it needs to be equally as efficient and effective. And in order to grow or get the next loan, you have to pay back the first one
Right.
or be in compliant with it. It was kind of this
Yeah.
natural process. And when I was actually in my MBA program, I remember every time we did a lot of group projects over the 2 year period. I think every single one our group did about maybe putting in a new HR system, a new electronic medical record, or we were looking at
Mm-hmm.
our financial systems, or I just said, okay, I don't know how to do that, or we're void there, and it took off from there. And I have to say that we began using the low income housing tax credit model for our housing development, which is pretty complex. It's out of U.S.
Pretty
Treasury,
complicated. Yep.
um, and and so you had to have that level of sophistication to do that. But it greatly expanded our housing to where we have 23 service sites now from that one tiny little location. And
Wow.
we have over 1,200 units of housing, all different types of housing, from shelter,
Right.
transitional, permanent supportive housing for chronic homeless, and affordable housing, sober living homes, and a whole continuum of housing options, meeting people wherever they need for housing, wrapped with our core service of human and healthcare services.
It's amazing because you were talking about the benefits of site control long before that became a requirement in
Yeah.
some grants. Right now, we see, especially on services that serve the unhoused, they want you to have site control, and that wasn't even a phrase 20 years ago that showed up in RFPs. So that's fantastic. You mentioned home base, and in the series, I've been using home base to kind of illustrate the workings of a nonprofit over its life cycle from founding through hardship and into maturity. What was your first encounter with home base? How did you come to hear about it?
So I hope people enjoyed your conversation with Neil Sutton, because Neil Sutton is that link between NAC and home base. Neil was a new board member at Native American Connections and a longtime board member at Home Base Youth Services,
Hmm.
and he would remark that there's some similar core services and operational needs that we have. We're residential facilities, they have commercial kitchens, we have food service, we have 24 24/7 staff. We have a behavioral health
Yeah.
component and a housing component combined, and so there were real similarities. And when home base began to experienced some challenges, he thought the organization and the staff might benefit from some of the lessons learned, and some of the skill
Yeah.
sets that Native American Connections already had. So I'm going to give that credit to Neil Sutton, that crossover board member. And then we just began, and I think you were one of the crossover members. I think it was you and Neil,
I was a
and
crossover.
um, and then maybe one other person, Pat Rourke, I think, was the other
Pat
crossover
Rourke.
person. And
Yep.
so we began meeting with our board and our
Hmm.
staff leadership and just talking about, um, some of those what now they kind of call back office shop things that Native American Connections does well and has large capacity,
Yeah.
and began talking about how they might overlay with home based youth services. It was a We were already serving a homeless population. We
Yeah.
hadn't ever focused. We had a children's mental health program. We hadn't focused in our housing arena around a particular age group before, but it seemed really
Right.
natural. The physical plant was very similar to what we were already doing. We already were operating commercial kitchens. We were already feeding people 3 meals a day, 7 days a
Hmm.
week. And so the kind of the facility and operation side, and then learning about what are some of the specific needs, who the demographics of the youth population were,
Hmm.
came later. Um, and what I'd like to say is, again, we came in and we really listened to the staff at home base who were
Hmm.
providing the direct service. You're the experts. How can we learn from you? And
No, you
I
showed
just
that.
wanted to say
Yeah.
too that
I want
two
to
of the
say, yeah.
staff that are one is the director of all of our youth services, overseeing our new surprise facility and home base, and the supervisor at home base. There's staff that were there prior. They've been there 15 to 20 years. And so they're still
Yeah.
there providing that leadership and that support, that mission to serve homeless youth.
Right. Yeah. I asked Neil about this. I'm like, do you remember what Dede saw in home base? Because we were struggling. And, he remembers that you were committed to the mission, but I also distinctly remembered that you liked the staff, that you recognized that they were good at providing the services to the clients, even if the management at top had made some decisions that put some of the finances at risk. It had nothing to do with these people that were delivering really high quality services to a population that wasn't getting them all the time. So I do remember that, and I'm glad that they're
Yeah.
still around
And
all
not
these
just
years
still around,
later.
but,
Yeah,
in the top leadership positions still. And both of them,
yeah.
their personal commitment to serving homeless youth
Hmm.
remains as strong as ever.
One of the other things that you did in merging with Home Base, and I don't know if you remember this, but it speaks to something else that I want you to address. When you looked at the grants that Home Base had, you said, well, this grant here is costing you more to do than you're taking in, and it's a great service, but let's give it to somebody that can do it better, for cheaper, and have it make sense for them. And we did. And in working with you over the years, this is something that you don't do infrequently, that you give grants, you don't say, this is all mine. You look around and you say, well, no, you're better at this outreach right now. And actually, this amount of money would help you more and have a greater impact. So why don't you do that? How did you learn to support other nonprofits as you're trying to keep NAC stable and growing and meeting the needs of its
Yeah,
clients?
I think that's being a community development organization, that you have a much broader sense of wanting to see all boats float, that you want
Mm,
everyone to be healthy in the community, that you can't be everything to everybody. We'd never chase grants. I like to say that because I know a lot of nonprofits that sort of strayed from their mission sometimes, kind of just bringing the money in the
mhm.
door. And we always said, if we
Yeah,
do this and we're the one of the best people to do this, let's go after that grant. If it's not, let's pull in a community partner, like you said, and let's get them to apply for that grant or share that grant.
mhm.
So I think we were really networking more than partnerships. We were really saying, let's work together on this to better our broader community. And I think that's what happens when you're not a single soul mission service or
Yeah.
organization. You're really this broad community development organization because you care not only about your organization, the people you're serving, but the broader
Mhm.
community in which they're going to be part of and the health of that broader community. We have on site at home base, and I know this was started when you were there, Phoenix Children's Hospital, their mobile unit still comes every week,
Yeah.
every
Oh,
Monday,
that's great.
and then provides the physical and some of the mental health and behavioral health services. We also have a co-located program there, NAC does, but Phoenix Children's comes every week and still provides that. That's almost a 20-year community-based
Yeah.
partnership. And St. Joseph the Worker is on site for workforce development. Those organizations where we think there's a stronger community partner, they're actually co-located on site, providing those services that are identified by the youth that are necessary for them to move from homelessness, back into the community, um, with all the skills and
Y-
resources they
something
need.
that yeah, something that you mentioned just a little bit ago, though, it might sound a little bit like a contradiction because and I'd like you to address it because you talked about the strength of the organization being that it's broad and community based, meeting a lot of different needs with different services, but then you're not chasing grants. And that's a really fine distinction because I know from being involved with many nonprofits that sometimes, especially if you're used to government funding, government changes. They have new whims, they have new concerns. And you have to pivot. You have to, in my opinion, or sometimes you get left behind because there's not funding for this thing that you used to do. So what's the difference between being broad and community driven in your services so that you can be flexible and strong, and the difference between that and chasing grants?
Yeah, Brad, I think that pivot is really even more important after COVID, that you do need to
Mm,
know when to pivot. And I think, rather than chasing something that it's available and it's out there and chasing a grant that might not be part of your core mission or service, is
hmm.
different than taking advantage of opportunity. And that's where I think
Okay,
NAC has a
explain.
strength, is we
Right.
are not afraid to move forward and move forward pretty quickly with an opportunity.
You're also speaking, though, to a long term perspective where you're not just concerned with what is good for my particular organization in this moment, but what's good for our community in the long term, because what's good for our community in the long term is ultimately going to be good for all the people that we serve right now. And it's a shift in perspective. And I've been involved in organizations that could not bring that perspective to bear, and they were the worse for it. Speaking of that long term perspective, what are your thoughts about where home base is now? Given that it's been so many years since they've become part of the Native American Connection constellation of services, and tell us a little bit about where they are now and your thoughts on that.
So I'm going to say at least once a month, I have someone coming to tour home base, an elected official. We have lots of people that come, but an elected
Yeah.
official or a committee or something. Home base is sitting in the heart of the Devonshire neighborhood. And that neighborhood association still meets in home base. And the reason I start with this is
Yeah.
we're what they now kind of call a pocket shelter. So we're this 25-bed shelter sitting in the middle of the neighborhood who's now integrated as part of the neighborhood, where neighbors might call Mike, the director, and say, "Hey, I saw this kid out there. What's going on?" That they're very concerned
Mm.
about youth that are homeless now, that they don't become the homeless of tomorrow. The homeless
Right.
population is growing in Phoenix, the unsheltered population is growing. And I think our community around home base really understands that if we can intervene and change the trajectory of a homeless youth right now and give them the skills to not return to homelessness, that we're preventing, that later on. But sitting home base is like this perfect example of this small pocket shelter that can fit in the heart of a neighborhood, that can operate efficiently and effectively, and that people really get it and understand the importance of a youth not risking being out on the street, how dangerous it is for them, and
Mm.
getting them in quickly, and kind of the length of time of that they need in shelter. What are the key components that you need
Yeah.
for a youth to be walking on to the next level of self-sufficiency in their own apartment or back into the community? I think we've become, that model. And people come both for the physical plant, how we're embedded in a neighborhood, how we work with the neighborhood, how we avoid NIMBYism, but also the program requirements,
Right.
what we're doing that makes it's pretty turnkey there now. And we were able to take the opportunity of money that became
Yeah.
available and acquire a site on the West Valley that has no shelter at all, none,
Wow.
not just youth shelter,
Wow.
but no shelter, and open a new 40-bed homeless youth shelter in the
Wow.
West Valley. Beautiful facility, and doubling our capacity for homeless youth. Same
Yeah.
partners, 1 in 10, serving the LGBTQ community,
Wonderful.
Phoenix Children's Hospital, St. Joseph the Worker, but bringing in new partners from the City of Surprise and their human services. And we actually had to have a use permit, a special permit, which made us go through the zoning process. And I'm always concerned about that. How would they feel about the first shelter in the City of Surprise? And they asked one question about parking and then made a motion and a unanimous vote to approve the
Yeah.
shelter there. So I think that reputation of how we serve home-based youth carried over
Hmm.
into our expansion into Surprise with very little opposition, knowing that we'd be good neighbors, that we'd bring a good quality facility, and that we would serve a community that was underserved in the Surprise area.
I'd like to think it's home base's reputation. I personally think it has a lot to do with Dede Yazzie Devine's reputation. And I just want to say that I just want thank you so much for your almost 44 years of service to the valley. You've changed the landscape of the city for the better, and I'm always in awe. And I'm looking forward to your next 44 years of service to the valley too. So thank you for being a
Thank you,
guest, Dede.
Brad. And thank you for, I've always appreciated what you've done in the community and how you carry yourself personally and how you take that into, really expanding what you know to the community. I appreciate that as well. Thank you.
That was Dede Yazzie Devine. For more information about Dede and home base youth services, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. My examination of the management of nonprofits concludes next week, when you will hear from some of home base's clients. Subscribe, because you will not want to miss it. As always, our theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young children, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.